The Edmonton Oilers might be limited on cap space, but that doesn't mean there's a cap on creativity. On today's edition of Locked On Oilers, Ike Howard is the newest Edmonton Oiler, what that means going forward, what it says about the team's direction, and why you should be excited.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. Just wrapped up my third NHL season as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network. I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Monarch Money. Take control of your finances today with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year's subscription. On today's show, we are going to be talking all things Ike Howard, who has, as he told the Edmonton media earlier on Wednesday afternoon, he'd like to be called Ike, so we will be abiding by his request, referring to him as Ike Howard by our default. It might take a little while to get used to that, but that's doable. The man has a name. He'd like to be called one. That's fine. So to start things out, we're going to talk about this purely from a roster construction and logic standpoint. Our second segment, we will pivot to Howard's game himself. Our final segment, we will talk about what his application to the Oilers is right now, where he could end up, and why I am so excited. So to start things out, when you are a good team, you are occasionally afforded luxuries. Sometimes that manifests in veteran players offering to take less money to facilitate staying longer. Sometimes that means your star players take a little bit less off the top so you can afford one more bottom six forward or one more third pair defenseman or a better backup goalie. Sometimes that means you're a marquee destination for free agents, whether that's you're a consistent contender, you have a particularly spendy owner who really does a nice job with the amenities and the non-capped spending, not salary. But when you're a team like the Oilers that is consistently over the last handful of seasons solidified yourself amongst the league's best teams, and you have Connor McDavid and you have Leon Draisaitl, you are a desirable destination. You saw Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson use this methodology last season. Obviously, didn't particularly work out for either of those guys, but it did work out in this case because even though the Oilers are extremely cap-strapped and they will have to make some decisions about who's going to stay on the NHL roster versus who's going to go to the AHL, the Oilers knew they needed at least one more forward to come into training camp with. And I had surmised earlier in the week, maybe Jeff Skinner would be a good candidate for that based on the familiarity, the fact he wouldn't be able to command a lot coming off of the season he had, and the fact he had reasonably good underlying numbers and counting stats in his very minimal role on last year's Oilers. But to Stan Bowman and the Oilers front office's credit, they saw an opportunity to knock out several birds with one stone. Number one, the Oilers were the oldest team in the NHL last year. You lost Philip Broberg, Dylan Holloway, and Warren Foegele all in one offseason. You replaced them with Victor Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner. You traded for Vasily Podkolzin, who's not that old, but you had an old team, and you got older after losing in the Stanley Cup final the first time. Now, there are some benefits to that. The Oilers were amongst the most prepared teams in the NHL, one of the few teams that was able to make up for the fact they really struggled down the stretch in the regular season and able to really take steps to improve as the playoffs went along because veterans have so much experience to draw upon. Then, the second part of this, they needed to get creative financially. Now, this restricted free agent / drafted player rights market can be lucrative. Where the Oilers found Ike Howard is not a bad place to be shopping if you need to get creative. And look, when you are cap strapped the way the Oilers are, you need to get inventive. You need to think unorthodoxly. And when it comes to acquiring the rights to a drafted player or the rights to a restricted free agent, it can be tricky because the team that holds the rights, whether we're talking about a drafted player or a restricted free agent who doesn't currently have a contract, you end up in a position where that team doesn't have a whole lot to stand on. They are purely asking you to pay on the hypothetical that this guy should be very good. There's no NHL track record, or if it's a restricted free agent, only a handful of seasons worth of experience to draw upon to form conclusions. And when it comes to these types of guys, the college free agents, they now, especially in the new landscape where guys can get paid in college down here in NCAA hockey, there's a real opportunity for guys to leverage their way where they want to go. There's a real opportunity for guys to play their way into some money. You saw Gavin McKenna sign with Penn State for $700,000 in NIL money. That is a gaudy amount of money to be promising one guy on a team of 20 some odd players. But now there is a real impetus on the team, the drafted rights holding team, to get something for that guy, because hypothetically, Howard, after a certain amount of time, his rights would have expired. The Tampa Bay Lightning would no longer have owned his rights. And you would have a situation similar to what we saw with Jimmy Vesey, Kevin Hayes, Matt Gilroy in the 2010s, where those guys, they were drafted. Kevin Hayes by the Blackhawks, Jimmy Vesey by the Predators, and I forget who drafted Matt Gilroy off the rip, but ultimately all three of those guys ended up signing with the New York Rangers, and those college free agents had agency. They could pick where they ended up. And now, Ike Howard is someone who wanted to go to a place where he was going to have an opportunity to get to the NHL ASAP. Now, Tampa Bay is a very well-run organization. If Tampa Bay felt he wasn't ready for the type of role they would want him to play, I would be a little reticent, because Tampa Bay has generally done a pretty good job with their talent management. But if the Oilers make gambles the way they did, they are telling you they understand the gravity of this situation. The Oilers cannot wait for cap considerations to become more clear. They cannot wait for no movement clauses to become limited no trade clauses. You are burning daylight every single season that goes by with Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl under contract. If you are the Oilers, you cannot afford to not be taking chances, because at the worst, you're going to be a playoff team. At the best, if you take enough chances on upside, on potential around your stars, that's where you can close a gap. You swing for a restricted free agent or two. You trade for a prospect who hasn't gotten any opportunity yet, and then you put them in a position to succeed. You're basically making pure profit. And real quick, I was at least curious about what Logan O'Reilly would ultimately become, but the Oilers need help right now. Logan O'Reilly becoming a really good two-way forward 3 to 4 years from now. At that point, McDavid's 31 or 32, Draisaitl's 32 or 33. You got to make your decisions, and you got to have conviction. Of course, the Oilers are adding volatility to their team and bringing in a young forward who doesn't have an NHL track record. But it shows you their thinking, and it shows you that they understand the gravity of this situation. You only get franchise-altering superstars like McDavid and Draisaitl once every 20 years or so. You can't wait for your money situation to get better. Now, when you're only paying guys entry-level contracts, that's potential. Now, it's incumbent upon the Oilers to realize that potential. And speaking of potential, coming up next on Locked On Oilers, we're going to break down what Ike Howard brings to the Oilers in terms of his skill set, areas he still needs to improve, and then in our final segment, we will pivot to where you can expect to see him in the lineup this upcoming season. Be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Do you ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning for a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO to give you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is so much more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So you're not just managing your money, you are building wealth. Something I definitely am guilty of from time to time is not putting money aside enough for my big plans, a vacation or something that's going to be a couple weeks worth of saving to get. I've been looking at getting a new pair of noise canceling headphones. Monarch helped me set a plan, stick to it every week. And now, thanks to Prime Day, I'm going to be taking those home. If you are ready to take control of your finances with Monarch Money, use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year subscription. One more time, that's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year's subscription. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers as we're breaking down all things Ike Howard, what it means for the Oilers, what it means for Howard himself. And speaking of Howard himself, if you're unfamiliar, and believe me, I had to read up, I am not particularly well-versed in prospects. The Oilers being a team that didn't have a first-round pick this year, the Oilers being a team that aren't really in the development cycle right now. They're not in a rebuilding period. And the Rangers, my children, my terrible hockey team, not being particularly adept at developing guys and not having anyone of particular note, I am not as tuned in with prospects as I am with free agents, trades, and the NHL at large. I don't watch a lot of college hockey. I don't watch a lot of junior. I don't watch a lot of European leagues. I'm watching the NHL. When the Oilers aren't on, when the Rangers aren't on, I am watching hockey. If it's the Kraken, if it's the Sharks, if it's Utah, if it's Florida, if it's Carolina, if there's NHL hockey on from October through June, I will be tuned in at some point of the night just to keep tabs on things. So I did have to read up. I did have to go watch a few video scouting reports. I did have to watch a little bit of tape to get a bit of an understanding as to what you can expect from Ike Howard. Number one, I even knew this. He won the Hobey Baker Award last year for the best player in NCAA hockey. That's nothing to sneeze at. You look at the last winner, Macklin Celebrini. He was pretty good for the Sharks last year. And look, I think we all need to keep things in perspective and in context. I am not a particularly big fan of drafting guys from college hockey. I think it really only makes sense if you are in a multi-year rebuilding period. And thankfully for the Oilers, the Lightning and the Blackhawks, for that matter, subsequently did the work. Howard's been in college for the last few years, and the Oilers weren't responsible for him there. It wasn't their problem if he didn't develop, if he didn't do well. If you're a team in that rebuilding phase and you draft an 18-year-old who's committed to play at an NCAA school, and they're there for 2 or 3 years, you don't have them under your thumb. You can't keep as good of eye on them as if they're in your organization. And then number two, the Hobey Baker Award is voted on. It is not necessarily the most reflective of that given season of college hockey. Jimmy Vesey very famously won it in the 2010s because 2 teammates on Boston College split the vote that given year, and Jimmy Vesey took home the award. Now, Vesey's carved out a nice NHL career for himself as a bottom 6 forward, really good defensive impacts, but nothing along the lines of what the Oilers would be expecting from Mike Howard going forward. Now, most impressively and most notably about his game is his shot. Howard is one of the better goal scorers in this prospect grouping. In his draft, the 2022 draft, he was considered somewhere between the second and third best raw goal scorer of that draft class, went at 31 or 32 overall to Tampa Bay. And when you look at this type of player, there were some caveats. Number one, I am very reticent about how high-end talent developing in college hockey translates to the NHL. And some of this is my personal perspective on college hockey. Now, when you play at a major program, when you play at a school like Michigan State or Minnesota Duluth or Minnesota or Michigan or Wisconsin, or apparently Penn State now, you are not always going to be playing the highest quality of competition. Now, that's not to denigrate Division I college hockey. God knows I wouldn't stand a chance against Division I college hockey players. But when we're talking about this in the context of the NHL, and we are talking about this in the context of skill sets and what translates, when we are talking about this in the context of college hockey, it's a lot less structured, and it is a lot more of splash plays and really gifted players making plays because the talent level is lower. Generally speaking, the best amateur and youth hockey players in North America, they don't go the NCAA route. And now that's changing. I'll be curious to see how NIL becoming a factor changes things if we see more players from both abroad, not just Canada, but Europe as well, opting for the path of college, trying to look for a scholarship and NIL money so that they could revisit their academics when their playing career's over. I know Ryan McDonough of the Lightning went back and finished his degree at the University of Wisconsin all these years later because he had that commitment as part of his scholarship. But I'll be curious to see about that. But when it comes to Howard himself, the big thing and the big curiosity for these college hockey guys is physically how are they going to translate? The workload in college versus the NHL could not be more different. Last year, including playoff games, Howard only played 37 games at Michigan State. Now, you think about that in the context of an NHL season where you're playing 2 games in 3 days every 2 to 3 weeks. You're playing 82 games from the course of October through mid-April, and that's effectively only getting you halfway there. It's very commonplace to see guys who played college hockey where you're only playing twice a week, and those games are pretty spaced out over the course of a few months, maybe 3 times a week, and you're playing weekend series where you play the same team 2 days in a row, 2 days and 2 games in 3 days. You got to think about it in terms of just the physical grind. And we talked about this the other day, actually, in terms of goalies, where we see these developmental goalies go from 20-ish starts to 50 in a season and a half and hit a physical wall midway through. I do think there is some cause for concern there. And then the big question mark that kept coming up in the scouting reports I was reading about Howard, where's his motor? Where's his compete? How is he along the boards? Because at the college level, his abilities are good enough that he can make those plays outside of structure. But in the NHL, at the NHL level, where everybody's got that baseline level of skating ability, everybody's got that baseline positioning ability, it puts you in a weird spot where you're going to need to learn on the fly, adapt to what's going on around you, but still do the things that you're good at. And I'm really highlighting the difference between college and the junior path because I really do feel that junior path is probably, at least for now, the better course of action for guys who are going to be high-end players. And that's not to say Howard can't be a high-end player. I think this is a very worthwhile gamble because if this works out, this is a 25, 30 goal guy. Now, I'm not saying he's going to score 25 or 30 goals this upcoming fall into next spring, but I think if everything works out, 2 to 3 years from now, we could be talking about Ike Howard being a 25, 30 goal guy at the NHL level. The release is there. It's simply a matter of the rest of his game. Where's his skating at? How much better can it get? You know, the most famous example of this being Braden Point, who fell in his draft year because teams weren't crazy about his skating, and the Lightning made him a better skater over time. How will Ike Howard adapt to the NHL game based on his experiences? It presents a fascinating question. And then coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we're going to break down where I think he should play in the lineup, where he likely will play in the lineup, and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday Ike Howard edition of Locked On Oilers. And look, we have an entire summer to argue about where Howard belongs in the lineup. You saw Bob Stauffer very, very proactively say, let's slow our roll here. You saw Jim Matheson say the same deal. He's only played in college. He hasn't played in the AHL. He hasn't played in the NHL. Is it realistic to ask him to play on the first or second line right away? Is it realistic to ask a guy who's never played at the NHL level to play with McDavid or Draisaitl? I know I talked about that a lot over the course of the regular season when we were talking about Kasperi Kapanen and Vasily Podkolzin, the idea that it's hard to play with good players. Not everybody is cut out for that. Not everybody has the skill set or the adaptability to be able to change their game to fit where they need to go. Some guys are really only good at what they're good at, and some guys can't change that. Some guys can't become complementary pieces. And at the same time, I do think we all can be adults here and acknowledge that if Ike Howard, if Matthew Savoie are going to reach their potential as NHL players, they need opportunities. And I talk about this so much. This is my probably my single favorite topic in all of sports, is talking about player development. There are so many factors that go into whether or not a gifted amateur player makes it at the NHL, the NFL, the NBA, the professional soccer ranks, whatever league, whatever MLB, whatever league you're talking about. There are so many factors that go into how successful a guy can be. The longer I have been doing sports content, the more I've thought that environment matters almost more than your talent. I think the truly special players are gifted enough to overcome their environments. They have enough in their toolbox that no matter what's going on around them, they have the capacity to outplay those factors. Now, the vast majority of players are going to fall into the box of being environmentally conscious. And now, not in the green, eco-friendly kind of sense, but environmental conscious, where you can do things to get more out of them. And I think that's true of most players to almost every extent, if we're going to be honest. If you're only going to give offensive zone faceoffs, if you're going to try and avoid the other team's best defensive players, if you're going to give a player power play time, those are all examples of environmental factors to produce better results. I think the Oilers need to understand that if you want Howard, if you want Savoie, if you want these guys to realize a good chunk of their potential, they're going to need runway. They are going to need room to figure it out. There will be ups, there will be downs. The goal by giving these guys opportunities is that they learn. And I know, generally speaking, Stanley Cup contenders do not have rookies in their lineups. For the most part, really good teams that go the distance come May, June, they are veteran laden. They are not asking guys to do things they've never done before. I also understand that the Oilers are kind of in a beggars can't be choosers situation. Now, I think the Oilers will almost certainly add a forward next year's trade deadline. I don't even think that's really a point of conversation. You look at this group, and even though I like Howard, I like Savoie, I like some of the guys they've brought in on prove-it deals or reclamation project deals, this forward group needs more proven ability. And the exciting thing about young players like Howard, like Savoie, we don't know what they are yet. They can be anything. And we lop that projection onto them with the idea that maybe they can be that 25, 30 goal guy. Maybe they have something we desperately need until we start to get a sample. Then, based on that sample, we can start to project what a player is realistically going to be. The more unproven a player is, the wider the range of potential outcomes. That's why environment, and that's why the external factors matter so much, because there does come a point in a player's career where the angle of their trajectory does start to decline. And I think about this in a few different ways. I think about it in terms of the opportunity. Because when a guy is at that first real prove-it point, you know, they get to the NHL for the first time, their rookie season, the trajectory could be anything from a flat horizontal line to a straight up vertical line. If you start on that middle path, and you get a lot of opportunities, and you start playing well, and you start building confidence, and you start earning more responsibility, and your coach starts to believe in you, the opportunities you're going to get become better. You start to play with better players. You work your way onto a power play, and then you start producing counting stats. And the more counting stats you produce, the easier it's going to be for you to convince your coach that you belong up there, that it's not a fluke, that this isn't just a lucky streak. And that's why it's so important in these early stages of a player's development that you ride the waves, you take the lumps. Because if you mess with a guy's confidence, if you don't give him that room to fly, the peacock, you got to give them room, let the spread their wings. If you don't give guys the room they need, if you don't put guys in a position to earn opportunities, if you say things, well, no, he can't play there, he's never played there before. You don't know. He might not be able to. He probably can. But don't you want to know, as opposed to just assuming? Assuming puts you in an awkward position as a coach. Because A, it's telling that kid you don't trust him. And B, if he plays well, you're looking bad because, well, if he's doing good in a smaller role, we should probably find out if he can do more, because that answers a question for us. And then the other side of that, if he struggles, how do you build a guy's confidence if you don't trust him and you don't want to play him a lot and you're playing him on a third or a fourth line? And look, I think with Howard's skill set, there are some questions as to whether it would make sense to play him on a third or a fourth line, especially with the type of personnel you're going to see down there. How much is he going to learn and grow playing with Adam Henrique and Trent Frederick? How much is he going to learn or grow playing like Matthias Janmark? How much opportunity is there if you're playing in a bottom six role? You're not on power play one. That line generally has the defensive responsibilities. It really puts you in an awkward position. And as much as Howard or Savoie, for that matter, haven't necessarily earned the responsibility of playing with McDavid or Draisaitl, I think the Oilers would be really dumb to at least not give it a serious consideration. Now, I think you obviously go based off of the evidence. If they start to play well, you keep going until they don't. If they come out of the gate and they look like they don't belong, okay, we adapt. We reconfigure our lineup. We need these guys to play. The more they play, the more they learn. The more they learn, the more well-rounded they become, the better players they are. That's your goal in acquiring young players, in getting these prove-it prospect rights or a restricted free agent. You now have to do the legwork. It's not just enough to acquire someone who has a lot of talent. There are a lot of talented hockey players who never make it at the NHL level because the circumstances don't line up. They never build their game to where they need to get it to, and they end up moving on. Jesse Puljujarvi, who I still think has a role on a decent team as a third or a fourth liner, he signed in Europe. That's a really unique set of circumstances. You're talking about the hips, really serious injuries, but at the same time, that's a guy who was good enough to go where he went in the NHL draft, and because the opportunities didn't line up, he wasn't really in a great spot. He never really built up his confidence in his game. He never grew into something teams felt good about, and he ended up moving on and on and on. And look, injuries play a factor, circumstances play a factor, but for the Oilers, Ike Howard has the potential to be a real difference maker. It's incumbent upon them to try and channel that best they can. And again, I'm not saying he's entitled to playing with McDavid or Draisaitl, but you're going to get better results with a sniper playing with one of those two guys as opposed to playing him on a third or a fourth line role. That will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, a 5-star review would mean a hell of a lot. If you're watching over on YouTube, subscribe, hit the like button. Let me know what you're expecting from Howard this upcoming season. You think he sticks? 10 goals, 20 goals, 30 goals? 30 goals would be kind of sick. The Oilers could use 30 goals from someone who's making an entry-level contract. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.